Very good. Grace and peace to all the people of God. To Pastor Sarah Wilcox, my beloved former student at Chicago Theological Seminary, whose face I am happy to see, part of it anyway, whose sincerity and passion for the work of ministry, even the hard parts, make my heart glad. To the ministry staff, to the officers, members, youth, and friends of Land of the Sky United Church of Christ, thank you for the opportunity to worship God with you on this day that we have not seen before, with faces that at least I have not seen before, each of which reflects back to me something of the character and creativity of God. I am an ordained Christian minister, recently become a member of the United Church of Christ. Since 2009, I have also studied the teachings of the Buddha with Heiwa Nobushi, abbot of the Bodhicristo Sangha at the Thomasville Buddhist Center, not far from here. I wish to thank him heartily for his leadership, for his love, and for his support. The greatest thing that I have discovered in my evolving, unfinished life is that no matter where you jump into the ocean of God's love, your feet will never touch bottom, especially not if you give yourself over to the enjoyment of its amazing healing properties and do not simply endure it or fear drowning in the fantastic diversity of life under holy water. There is so much more to witness of divine reality and human possibility than we can see when we live only on and for the surface. That is what the combination of my life experiences, ministry, and education as a Black, womanist, spiritually eclectic liberation theologian has taught me. Tuesday, June 15th at 2 p.m. is the time set for my ordination as a Lama or teacher of the Dharma, the spiritual and psychological medicine that the Buddha gave for navigating the sacred trust and the suffering difficulty of being human. After my first and second ordinations in 1991 and 1992, this will be another holy moment in my life, coming to me as a relief from the burden of keeping God in a box or a bucket of ocean water labeled Christian. Did not Jesus say something like, "Other buckets I have that do not look like yours? The people who carry them must also step into the deep and have theirs filled"? Well, maybe he didn't say exactly that, but he did say, according to the Gospel of John, "Other sheep I have who are not of this fold." And he did say that God is a spirit, and those who worship must worship in spirit and in truth. And he did also say, "Love one another as I have loved you, so you must also love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." My point is, we often recite scriptures to which we give no real credence if they contradict the doctrines and habits that mortals have created, like the odious separation and ranking of the worth of our neighbors by color, gender, orientation, economic means, nationality, creed, religion, and even aesthetical preferences. Whether we believe that Jesus is very God of very God, begotten, not made, or that he embodied the very essence of God, or that he was fully human and was the perfect example of moral uprightness, would not his praxis of loving, feeding, and healing his neighbors without price, particularly not the price of their social, cultural, or religious conversion, lead us to believe that he would, if he knew him, love the Buddha and regard him and the path he articulated as the jewel in the lotus, the beauty, within the muck and the mire of life. Would not the compassionate Buddha, if he had witnessed from the farther shore the love, wisdom, sacramental, surrendered, restored, and restorative life of Jesus, love him and regard him as a pearl of great price? These world-changing teachers, the yogi and the rabbi, both of whom forsook the high privilege of being the son of a king and the son of a god, respectively, went out from their cities, Lumbini and Nazareth, to the poor and the outcast in their midst, to the sick, the aged, and the dying, and gifted them with somebodyness, of which the caste system in India, the Roman occupiers of first century Palestine, and the religious gatekeepers in both places had deprived them. Yet although they had planted seeds of compassion and inspired benevolence in the hearts of their disciples through their actions and the lessons in their parables, the denial of somebodyness to anyone is fundamentally a question of justice, according to my beloved late mentor, Dr. James Cone. It is not merely a question of how much benevolence or how much compassion we have cultivated in our religious identity, the masks we wear for the benefit of others. Benevolence at the expense of justice is not benevolent or compassionate at all. As the prophet Micah famously asked, "What does the Lord require of us mortals but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God?" Doing justice is first among those directives that were uttered for Israel and Judah in the 8th century before the Common Era, and that the synagogue, the temple, the church, and the mosque in the 21st century in the Common Era need to heed. Somehow in the church, in our individualistic take on what it means to be religious, we have got it backwards. Walking humbly, at least in front of other people, giving the evidence of our particular brand of piety and our faithfulness, loving kindness in qualified ways at those times when it is convenient or benefits us, and not doing but expecting justice for ourselves anyway, whether we accord it to others or not, whether we see them as deserving of the presumption of somebodyness or not. But somebodyness in others is not ours to dispense or withhold. I do not have the time or desire to catalog all the deaths of those deprived of somebodyness before our very eyes, or the multiple ways that somebodyness, lessness manifests in the world. But didn't we here in the US shrink just a little bit more as a society, as the church, as witnesses of divine love, as champions of human worth? Didn't we shrink just a little bit more when Derek Chauvin slowly withdrew the presumption of somebodyness from George Floyd? I cringe every time I think about the ways that Buddhist fellows in Myanmar withhold justice loving kindness, and the presumption of somebodyness from the Rohingya people who fled Bangladesh and are experiencing a refugee crisis of massive proportions. The hawks in Israel also do a disservice to their own identity as the covenant people of God, while they continually dispossess the Palestinian people of land and the presumption of somebodyness. The warmongers in America too. We diminish ourselves in the process when we withhold the presumption of somebodyness from others, because we decenter everything we have learned about God in scripture, tradition, reason, and experience from the throne of our hearts and minds, and replace God with a hell of our own making. Sometimes, perhaps more than we care to admit, we put more faith in the validity of our fears than in the enduring light and eternal love of our teachers. And our faithful, loving God becomes the broken-hearted one in our midst. Sometimes we put more faith in whatever power we are privileged to exercise as parents, preachers, pastors, teachers, bosses, military and law enforcement personnel, politicians, and presidents, rather than see the world as interconnected and all of our relationships as sacred trusts. And our faithful, loving God becomes the broken-hearted one in our midst. Some of us put more faith in the right to bear arms than in our teachers' positive, constructive engagement of society. And our faithful, loving God, who makes the rain to fall and the sun to shine on the just and the unjust, becomes the broken-hearted one in our midst. But fear not is more than just a directive that Jesus spoke countless times during his short time here on earth. It is more than the Abhaya Mudra hand gesture that Buddhists have striven to emulate for centuries. It is a seed of faith that disciples for millennia to come would learn to walk not in fear, but in wonder at the beauty that God has wrought in the world, and the hope that we would learn to use our human agency in service to the world to preserve justice for the world. Jesus' modeling of right relationship to power is not simply for us to marvel at and to exempt ourselves from the attempt to be like, just because we too often feel the urge to grab and grasp at the things we think we need. It is a seed of faith that we who are truly his disciples will pattern our lives after one who, though he was in the form of God, did not count even equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself rather. He made himself of no reputation, taking on the form and the plight of the enslaved, those who were and are systematically deprived of somebodyness. Love one another is not just wishful thinking on the part of Jesus, and the cultivation and embodiment of metta or bodhicitta is not just one of the 10 paramitas or perfections in Buddhism. The commandment to love one another, to regard one another as precious somebodies, is the ultimate seed of faith, the faith of our teachers in the possibility of a transformed world, as impossible as that seemed then and as impossible as it seems now. But this I call to mind, and therefore I have hope, The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. The Lord's mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is thy faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. That's the seed of faith. Therefore, I will hope in God. What becomes of a seed or the seeds of faith? No matter who sows it, if it becomes prey to the greedy, unrepentant, or falls on the stony and thorny parts of the landscapes of our hearts, we may never realize how wonderful it is to relinquish fear, to share power, and to experience the fact that power actually grows exponentially, not when it is regarded as a zero-sum game with people's lives, in fact, with their somebodyness at stake, but power grows when it is passed on and shared. The Greek word dunamis, from which we get the word dynamite, is the power of which Jesus often spoke, out of which he operated, by which he accomplished miracles. It is the difference between what happens when I worship God alone and when we worship God together, in spirit and in truth. It is the difference between being a sometime advocate for spurious injustices and becoming aware that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. It is becoming vigilant together for protecting the presumption of somebodyness for those who are regularly deprived of it. In this context, it is the ability to say that Black lives matter, brown lives matter, stop anti-Asian violence, stop Islamophobia, without the need to demur or to equivocate or to qualify at all, because it is these lives for which the presumption of somebodyness is not a given, and which are daily subject to injury and death in absurd, surreal circumstances that can befall anyone suddenly. If the seeds our teachers have sown fall prey or in the stony places of the landscapes of our hearts, we may never learn to love truly, deeply, and broadly, which is the seal of the Spirit that brings joy, peace, and contentment. But if the seeds our teachers have sown fall in the fertile places of our hearts and minds, humanity might be able to recognize just how beloved we are, just how much it pleases God to have made us in our individuality as well as in our collective identities as symbols of God's powerful love of diversity. We can defend the presumption of somebodyness for every person or group of people, and humanity can flourish spiritually, intellectually, materially, and every way. This is what our teachers and our God ask of us. This is ostensibly why we are learning to place our faith and trust in their words and not in our fears. Why we place our stakes on their demand for justice and not on our lust for power, and why we value love as our highest collective calling as human beings with a strong sense of compassion and responsibility for how the world in which we live and move and navigate our being turns out. I love the brooks, the streams, the lakes, and the rivers. They are beautiful natural spaces that conjure up for me precious memories of going fishing with my beloved late mother, of canoeing, of sailboat rides, and of sitting on their banks, tossing rocks onto the surface of the water and watching the ripples form and spread. They are marvelous in their regularity and in the rhythms and in their biodiversity. but they are not the ocean, which I think is a better metaphor for my witnessing of the depth and vastness, the steadfastness and extravagance of the love of God, not only for me and those who believe as I do, or who have my social status, or who have the same embodied reality as I do, but also for the whole world, all of the people in it, and all of creation, whom and which it pleased God to make and to love. Amen, Amen, and Ashe.